Okay, so moving on to week 5, a couple quick announcements on this week before I kind of walk you through some of the main themes of it. One thing I've done is changed your readings from what they were in the syllabus, and you'll find them in the tab on eCollege under week 5. So you do not need to do the Bray Boy and I think it's Mahan reading of the indigenous knowledge and the story of the bean. I'll talk a little bit about what's in that article. It's a really great article, but instead I'd like to have you read through the multiple intelligences that I've listed on. I actually copied it and pasted it in one of your tabs under week 5. So please read that instead. I also have created or included a link with a test to take a test yourself, just sort of a survey to kind of identify where your strengths are with the multiple intelligences. And I'll ask you to take that and to bring that into our discussion this week. And if you disagree with what the results are of that test, that's absolutely fine. Just let us know that and why in the discussion board. Okay, so basically I want to go through in some sort of order these ways of knowing, these multiple intelligences, learning styles, and then talking about the different sorts of learning outcomes. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about Bloom's taxonomy that you also have a reading or a link to this week, and how we can kind of use all of these things and how we should not use these things. So without further ado, first to kind of go through the different ways of knowing. These are in the LeBaron reading. And I think that LeBaron's book is on culture and conflict, and so she uses these ways of knowing to help people understand and adapt to each other and think in different ways. And she really encourages us in the book to really step outside of our most comfortable ways of knowing and to validate other ways of knowing. So her 5 ways of knowing. The first is somatic. The somatic way of knowing is really this physical attunement. We've all had experiences, or many of us have had experiences, where you have a gut feeling about something and you just go with that. Some people have more of a tendency to think about things that way, or think with their body, or know with their body what's right, what's wrong, what they're going to do in certain situations. So that's the somatic. There's an emotional way of knowing. This would include things like emotional intelligence and emotional fluency. But it's also interesting to watch somebody who does identify with an emotional way of knowing. The way they work through things is through emotion. So you may know people, or you may be a person yourself, that when you are trying to figure out a problem, part of that is going through a process of getting emotional and getting upset about things and kind of reliving a situation to really know what you're going to do about it. And that would be the emotional way of knowing. Quick story, I once moderated a panel with this Latina woman who was sharing the way that her community dealt with racism amongst, in this particular case, a bus driver who was making racist comments about Latinos on the bus. And she was telling this story about what they were trying to do and what he was saying and how they felt, and kind of going on and on and on about what was happening. And this elderly white man, who was one of the donors of the event, walks in for the very end of her story. And when it came to questions and answers, he raised his hand and he said, I see you getting all emotional about this, but I don't see you suggesting any solutions. And she starts her response by saying, first of all, sir, emotions have their place. And I thought that was like the best, most exemplary example, excuse me, for lack of a better word, of an emotional way of knowing. And she kind of went on to show how they used that to solve the problem, how they sat with the bus driver and explained their history, to really let that bus driver understand who they were, who their people were, so that he might identify with them and empathize with them and maybe not make the remarks he was making. So that's my quick example of emotional knowing. Spiritual knowing, this is not religious. Certain people are very good at very spiritually understanding things. Sometimes it is rooted in religion, and sometimes it's really not. Being able to kind of center yourself in purpose and connection is a real spiritual way of knowing. It's difficult for me to describe this one because I am not a spiritual knower. I try my best to be, and sometimes I can do it, but it isn't my most natural way of thinking or knowing things. And even if I have sort of a spiritual inclination to do something, usually my logical mind will take over and I will discount that. So, moving on, there's this imaginative way of knowing. I do have this one. I'm pretty comfortable with this one. And let me just say, we all have, to some extent, all 5 of these. None of us have never had an experience with one of them at some time or another. But this imaginative, just being able to let go of the structures that kind of keep us thinking within the box and letting us think outside. So going back to what I was talking about with my intercultural comedy club and creating new designs based on not something I've necessarily seen before, but just kind of letting go to say, okay, what's the best way to educate people on this? Or what's the best way to facilitate a conversation on these things? So that's kind of an imaginative way of knowing, getting kind of outside of those normal structures. And the integrative one is kind of cheating. I mean, this one is really just combinations of these different sorts of knowings. And you can see how some really kind of fold together, I would say, like perhaps emotional and spiritual, although not necessarily. Spiritual and somatic might come together and be integrative in things like yoga. A lot of people who do yoga have a spiritual connection to the practice, and it's a physical practice as well. So that would be a good example of an integrative way of knowing. So, moving on, multiple intelligences. So, real briefly, I'll just go through these. And let me just say that they'll overlap with the ways of knowing, and they'll overlap with any sort of structure that you have for learning and knowing and thinking. And I think that's okay, but I think it's nice for us to take a look at understanding, learning, knowing, in some different frames. So, multiple intelligences, linguistic, you're very good with words, you're a great speaker. Logical is another one, you're good at math, you logically work through things in your mind. You're musical, you just pick up an instrument and have a good sense of how to play it. You're a singer, you have great rhythm. These are kind of musical intelligences. Body and kinesthetics. So athletes or dancers, not that dancers are not athletes, are good examples of people with good kinesthetic intelligence. Spatial, this one is different. I mean, it can be something like artistic people have a good sense, or people who draw, not to limit what artists means, but people who are drawers or painters tend to have a good spatial understanding, but also people like carpenters. I can readily admit that I am awful when it comes to spatial intelligence. I cannot tell you like how far a foot is. When I'm driving, I have to leave so much room between me and anything else because I just can't tell how close I am. So, and I am a terrible painter or drawer. I like to believe one day I'll retire and have time and become a great painter, but we'll see if that actually happens. Interpersonal, you're people smart. You kind of know what's happening with someone. You pick up on those sort of unspoken cues. This can be an advantage in intercultural situations sometimes, although I would say that it kind of depends on how embedded you are within your own culture. And then lastly is the intrapersonal. And this is really self-smart. Again, it's kind of that emotional intelligence. You would probably have an easier time with self-reflexivity if you have a strength in intrapersonal intelligences. Now I'm going to take a pause.